Welcome to this side event convened to raise the important intersection of the violations of freedom of religion or belief and the prohibition of torture. These rights often intersect. And I will start with just a preliminary comment that please don't, there is an official photographer, and this is a hybrid event, so I believe is being recorded. But please do not take pictures unless you are the official photographer in this room. All right, we will come back to our very excellent first speaker and proceed with our second speaker. So we have seen the violations of FORB and the prohibition of torture take place in many different geographic locations. Often laws criminalizing belief result in violations of the prohibition of torture by virtue of the dehumanizing nature of these laws. It's my honor to introduce Elizabeth Chiram.
She's here, Nazila's here, sorry.
So we're going to go with Nazila? Yeah. Pause that for a moment. Here we are still dealing with technology issues. So it is my honor to introduce the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Dr. Nazila Ghanea. Dr. Ghanea is Professor of International Human Rights Law and Director of the MSc in International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford. Her academic work is often connected with multilateral practice in international human rights law. She has contributed actively to networks interested in freedom of religion or belief and its interrelationship with other human rights, and has advised states and other stakeholders. We are honored that you can join us online, Naz. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you to the Jubilee campaign for inviting me to this important event. We are all here to hear from those who have suffered human rights violations, to learn from their courage and their resilience, and determined to seek to prevent such violations continuing in the future, to better respond, to respond earlier, and to speak to ameliorate their suffering. Now, a very Geneva manner of thinking about this nexus between the prohibition of torture, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment and freedom of religion or belief is to produce a report on it and seek to build bridges between different UN human rights mechanisms, to bring together civil society actors that may be focused on one rather and not the other of these rights, to seek better understanding about this nexus. The reason that prompted report AHRC 5849, which was presented last week, was that there was this big gap between all of us in the freedom of religion or belief world hearing so much about violations that, at least on the face of it, appear to constitute torture or ill treatment. But if we compare that to the jurisprudence that exists at the international level, at the regional level, and even at the national level, that explores the precise nexus of freedom of religion or belief and the prohibition of torture and ill treatment, we would be very disappointed. There really isn't much jurisprudence that has given focus to this. So the report tried to establish or encourage bridges of understanding between the UN human rights mechanisms, the actors, and really draw the attention of states to this nexus. And the report was presented last Tuesday and Wednesday. Of course, our paths crossed with Hulda, with Janet, with others from the Jubilee campaign and other actors in presenting that report and in side events that also occurred last week. And in the actual interactive dialogue when the report was formally presented to the UN Human Rights Council, 59 countries and a good number of civil society organizations spoke to this nexus. There were no objections to suggest that the mandate on freedom of religion or belief shouldn't tread on this territory of the prohibition of torture and ill treatment. In fact, state after state welcomed this report. At the very least, I think we can take the statements given by states in that interactive dialogue and use it as a foundation for engaging them if we have concerns about violations in that country, It should be the beginning of a conversation and stronger action on this nexus. And we can use the government responses given at that interactive dialogue for this purpose. Now, I really want to stop speaking now because I want to hear from you. It's the voices of victims around the world that inspired this report. And I'm sure everyone's here to hear more about that. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for holding this side events and giving attention to this matter.
Thank you so much for that overview and report of the report, which was really excellent and timely. So we are now going to come back to Elsa Chiram, who is here in the room with us. She is an Eritrean human rights activist based in the United Kingdom and is the director and founder of Human Rights Concern Eritrea. She has over 2 decades of experience with human rights advocacy with regards to Eritrea and refugee protection. Elsa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, I appreciate this opportunity to speak on the grave human rights situation in Eritrea, particularly the violations of freedom of religion or belief and the absolute prohibition of torture under its repressive regime. The 1997 Eritrean Constitution guarantees freedom of thought, conscience, and religion under Article 19. However, it has never been implemented, and the government severely restricts religious freedom or belief. Since 2002, the Eritrean government has officially recognized only 4 religious groups: the Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church, Roman Catholic Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church of Eritrea, and Sunni Islam. All unrecognized religious groups are banned or obstructed through registration. Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and other Protestant groups face arrest, torture, and enforced disappearance. Even recognized religious groups are government controlled, with followers subjected to arbitrary detention and inhuman treatment. Jehovah's Witnesses have been denied citizenship, employment opportunities, and imprisoned for not voting in the 1993 referendum for independence of Eritrea and refusing military service due to their religious beliefs. Evangelicals, Pentecostals, and other unregistered groups face severe persecution, with many detained for years, even decades, without trial and legal representation. They are pressured to renounce their faith, and if they refuse, endure prolonged detention, torture, forced labor, and sometimes death. Since 2002, their churches have been banned, forcing them to worship in secret, which the regime sees as subversive. The government targets them for operating outside state control and for perceived foreign ties, using torture to silence dissent, instill fear, and enforce conformity. Even within the state-sanctioned religion groups, the Eritrean government exerts total control over religious institutions. In 2007, Patriarch Antonius, the legitimate head of the Eritrean Orthodox Church, was removed, placed under house arrest, and denied medical care until his death in 2022, despite being severely diabetic for resisting state interference in church affairs. Currently, many Christians, including evangelicals, Pentecostals, Orthodox, Catholics, and Lutherans, are languishing in detention, some for over 20 years, without due process. They endure arbitrary arrest, prolonged imprisonment, and inhuman conditions, often without legal representation or fair trials. Jehovah's Witnesses also face arbitrary arrest and lengthy detention. Torture is widespread, systematic, and state-sanctioned, and affecting political prisoners, religious detainees, journalists, and military conscripts. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea concluded in 2016 that these acts amount to crimes against humanity. Victims endure severe physical and psychological abuse, extreme detention conditions, including confinement in metal shipping containers and underground cells, starvation as punishment, sexual violence, beatings, electric shocks, solitary confinement, forced labor, sleep deprivation, and denial of medical treatment. The Eritrean government has signed but not ratified the UN Convention Against Torture (CAT) and continues to block access to UN human rights monitors. It is incredibly difficult to hold the Eritrean government accountable for its crimes inside the country due to the absence of an independent judiciary and a functioning parliament. The regime operates with impunity, suppressing opposition and violating the rights of citizens. The Eritrean government has denied access to successive special rapporteurs and to the Commission of Inquiry, blocking scrutiny of its human rights practices. No human rights organizations are allowed to operate within the country. As a result, international pressure must continue in order to hold the government accountable and push for greater transparency and reform. Eritrea's victims deserve justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elsa, for that very moving testimony. The aim of this side event is to bring survivor voices to the forefront. It is therefore my honor to welcome Sheikh Mkhaitir, who has provided this pre-recorded statement in Arabic with English subtitles. Authorities in Mauritania sentenced him to death for apostasy. Eventually, he was acquitted, but not after they had already arbitrarily detained him for 6 years. He currently leads the organization Lumière Sans Frontières and is based in France, where he advocates the rights of those who are persecuted for their beliefs and opinions. Sheikh, the floor is yours.
مرحبا، أنا الشيخ محمد مخيطير من موريتانيا، ناشط حقوقي ورئيس منظمة تنويريون بلا حدود، لاجئ سياسي مقيم في فرنسا. لاجئ سياسي هارب من بلدي لأن قوانين بلدي تقتلني. هربت من بلدي بعد أن قضيت 6 سنوات من السجن الانفرادي بتهمة الردة، وذلك بعد أن قد كتبت مقالا أنتقد فيه العبودية والطبقية الاجتماعية داخل موريتانيا. أنتقد فيه القوانين التي تجبر الإنسان على أن يتوجه اتجاها واحدا، على أن يقر غصبا عنه بإيديولوجية واحدة لا بديل لها. قضيت 6 سنوات من التعذيب لأنهم يريدون لنا أن نكون عبيدا لهم ونحن نرفض. قضيت 6 سنوات من الألم، من الحزن، من الضغط النفسي، لا لشيء سوى أنني قلت لا للقمع. اليوم في موريتانيا ما زال الأمر متواصلا. الفتاة ماريا تقبع الآن وأنا أتحدث إليكم داخل في السجن الموريتاني بتهمة نفسها، وتواجه حكما بالإعدام، وسينطق هذا الحكم لا محالة في أول جلسة محاكمة لها. الكثير من المسيحيين هربوا من موريتانيا، هربوا من بلدهم، هربوا من أرضهم، تركوا ممتلكاتهم وراءهم. لماذا؟ لأنه لا مكان لهم في بلدهم، لأن هذا البلد، لأن هذا القانون، لأن هذه الدولة التي هي عضو في الأمم المتحدة تفرض على الإنسان حين يولد توجها واحدا ودينا واحدا وإيديولوجية واحدة يجب عليه أن يقبلها مرغما غصبا عنه، وإلا فإن الموت سيكون في انتظاره. إذا لم يكن الموت فهو سنوات وسنوات من السجن الانفرادي مثل ما حصل معي. أطالبكم جميعا، أطالب هيئات حقوق الإنسان، منظمات المجتمع المدني، الأمم المتحدة، كل الفاعلين، الحكومات، الأحزاب السياسية وغيرها بالتحرك والتدخل من أجل حماية الإنسان في بلدي. التدخل والضغط من أجل حماية حرية التعبير، من أجل حماية حرية الرأي، من أجل حماية مبدأ لا الذي يحق لنا جميعا أن نقوله وأن نعبر عنه وأن نبرره أو لا نبرره، المهم أن نقول لا، هذا حقنا. إن الصمت الدولي تجاه ما يحصل في موريتانيا هو أمر مخزن للغاية صراحة، لا يوجد له أي مبرر، ولذلك فإنني أتوسم فيكم القدرة على التحرك من أجل حماية حقوق الإنسان في هذا البلد، وأتمنى أن يتم ذلك في أسرع وقت ممكن قبل فوات الأوان، لأن الإنسان هناك في بلدي يتألم ويموت في الدقيقة 1000 مرة. أشكر لكم حسن الاستماع والإصغاء. شكرا لكم جميعا.
A warm thank you to Sheikh Mkhaitir for sharing this very painful personal story of his own persecution. I will now pass the floor on to Joseph Jansen, Advocacy Officer with Jubilee Campaign Netherlands and Chairman of Voice for Justice Pakistan. He is a strong voice for those persecuted for their faith in Pakistan, particularly those targeted by anti-blasphemy laws and those held in bond slavery. He has been active on human rights activism in Pakistan since his own sister became a victim of cruel anti-blasphemy law penalties. She and her husband endured over 7 years in prison for a text message deemed blasphemous. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and human rights defenders and authorities, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on a deeply urgent and pressing issue. I extend my gratitude to UN Special Rapporteur Nazila Ghanea for the vital work in highlighting the intersection of the religious freedom and the prohibition of torture. In Pakistan, this intersection has become a grave human rights crisis where blasphemy accusation, religious persecution, and state negligence fuel a cycle of violence, injustice, and inhuman treatment. Pakistan's blasphemy laws have long been weaponized to target religious minorities, resulting in powerful imprisonment, mob lynching, and judicial failure. These laws have not only failed to uphold justice, but have become a tool of oppressors. Cases like Nazir Masih, Michelle Khan, Shama, and Shahzada, who were live burnt at Brickell in Pakistan, is one of the examples. False accusation, often driven by personal dispute or religious intolerance, have led to brutally killing and wrongful death sentences. Those accused often undergo physical and psychological torture, including prolonged solitary confinement, even when there is no credible evidence against them. Religious minorities also undergo another horrifying form of persecution, that is forced conversion of minor minority girls and women in Pakistan. Christian and Hindu girls, some as young as 9-year, 10-year, 11-year-olds, are abducted, forcefully converted, and married off to their abductors. These cases of Shifa, Rafaqat, Ariha Gulzar, Alina Khalid exemplify this practice where young girls are torn from their families, stripped of their identities, and subjected to abuse, inhuman treatment. Once converted, these girls are often denied to justice while their families face threats, police inaction, and judicial bias. This is not just religious persecution. This is a grave violation of human dignity and form of systematic oppression. Another grave human rights violation in Pakistan is bonded labor. Despite laws prohibiting practice, economic hardship and poor enforcement have allowed modern-day slavery continue in Pakistan. Over 4.5 million workers, including entire families, remain trapped in death bonded in Brickell across Pakistan. These individuals undergo physical and psychological abuse and wages of some low that they can never break free. Women, children, particularly vulnerable, facing exploitation and forced labor in danger conditions. The Pakistani government's failure to address bonded labor perpetuates this form of systematic torture and allowing generations to remain enslaved. I speak not just only for research, but from my painful personal experience. My sister Kausar and her paralegal husband Shafqat Emmanuel were falsely accused of blasphemy and were sentenced to death in Pakistan. Due to the blasphemy accusations, blasphemy authorities disregarded his humanity and disregarded his disability, vulnerability. My brother-in-law was on a wheelchair when he was hanged upside and down to confess the crime he never committed. Then my own sister was threatened to sexual abuse to confess the crime they never committed. They both were sentenced to death and they spent 8 years in solitary confinement. They had 4 minor children. During their visit to the prison, children could only touch the fingers of my sisters when she was in the prison. They all are traumatized and they remain in exile for their safety reasons. Yet they are not alone. Others like Nadeem Masih, a Christian, was falsely accused of blasphemy. He's sentenced to death 3 times by the lower court. His appeal is at the High Court of Pakistan for simply being a friend of a Muslim woman, and false accusation made him to sentence to death. Since 8 years, he is in solitary confinement in Pakistan. Another, Zafar Bhatti, have been undergo prolonged imprisonment and a horrified condition. Shagufta Kiran was locked in darkness, airless cell for months, while this is Shagufta Kiran, a Christian woman sentenced to death by the FIA court, and she's behind the bar for a couple of years. She has 4 minor children. Another Shagufta, she's not my sister. This is another woman who is behind the bar right now. Another case of a man who was working with the government department. He's behind the bar for over 23 years in Pakistan. He's sentenced to death by the lower court in 2002. He was sentenced to death in 2014 by the High Court, and he's behind the bar for 23 years. He's an elderly man. He's around 70 years old. And Pakistan's own Institute of Mental Health has declared that this man is mentally unstable, simply because of his expression on religious or freedom. These are the examples that I'm sharing today. These human rights abuse demand urgent global attention. Freedom of religion or belief and the prohibition of torture and fundamental principle of human dignity and justice. These courage, violence, and institutionalized discrimination faced by religious minorities in Pakistan must recognize and end form of torture, dignitary treatment, requiring immediate interventions from the authorities. The international community cannot afford remain silent. We must push reforms to Pakistani blasphemy laws to prevent these abuses and force conversion and protect minority girls from abduction and abuse. Demand accountability for torture, extrajudicial killings, and mob violence. Address bonded labor and forced labor by ensuring the enforcement of anti-slavery laws. Eliminate religious discrimination in education and uphold the right of all citizens. Pakistan's continued failure to address these human rights violations is a stain on its legal and political institutions. We must demand accountability, legal reforms, concrete action to protect vulnerable communities. Human rights are not privilege. They are universal and they must be upheld without any exceptions. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. We know that you have been working tirelessly on these issues. We will now turn our attention back to the screen. Mariam Ibraheem is a strong advocate for victims of religious persecution and women who face gender-based violence and domestic abuse. She is the co-founder and director of Global Mobilization at Tahrir Al Nisa Foundation. Mariam Ibraheem is a survivor of torture and violations of freedom of religion and belief in her home country of Sudan. Okay. Yes, this is not Mariam. Mariam is coming.
This is speaking. This is speaking.
Because the sound is coming around. If you can tell Mariam to try speaking. Just speak. It was unmuted.
Okay. Mariam, can you try speaking, please?
And then try and mute him. And press the unmute button.
Press the unmute button, Mariam, and on the bottom left.
Go to the next speaker and then.
Okay. We will now cover our third continent, South America. We are honored to have Thibault van den Bossche here to share about the situation in Nicaragua. Thibault is the Advocacy Officer for Religious Freedom at the European Centre for Law and Justice. He is the author of a report on the persecution of Christians in Nicaragua from 2018 to 2024. Thibault, the floor is yours.
Thank you, madam. Do you hear me? It's okay for the sound? Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
So I shall start. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, since 2018, Nicaragua has been the scene of religious persecution of unprecedented brutality. The Catholic Church and other Christian denominations have become prime targets of the regime of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo. They are victims of crimes against humanity. Why? Because they represent one of the last spaces of freedom and opposition to a dictatorial power. The ECLJ wrote a report about it, which is to be found on our website. Since early 2025, Ortega and his wife Murillo have been officially co-presidents with no limit to the number of mandates and hold absolute power. The couple now controls the legislative, judicial and electoral bodies, as well as the regions and municipalities. This consolidation of power has been accompanied by an intensification of persecution against Christians. In 2018, Ortega brutally suppressed peaceful protests against a social security reform, resulting in 325 deaths. In response to this violence, priests opened their churches to demonstrators, offering them shelter and medical care. Since then, under a systematic campaign of terror, the church has been left with no choice but silence or dissolution. Priests self-censor their sermons to avoid arbitrary arrests. However, even this is not enough. More than 5,600 non-governmental organizations, many of them Christian, including parishes, schools, and Christian universities, have been dissolved by the government. More than 500 religious processions have been banned. 22 Christian media outlets have been censored. 250 members of the clergy, including 4 bishops, have been exiled. The year 2025 began with the closure of St. Luis Gonzaga Seminary, which trained 30 seminarians, and the expulsion of 30 Clarice nuns from the monasteries. Given these developments, the outlook for religious freedom in Nicaragua in 2025 is bleak. Without significant international intervention of major international change, it is unlikely that the situation will improve in the near future. This repression in Nicaragua goes beyond the mere restriction of religious freedom. It is a state policy aimed at eradicating all dissenting voices. It is a repressive campaign that uses imprisonment, torture, and expulsion as political weapons against Christians. Some interrogations of imprisoned Christians have taken place in the early hours of the morning, sometimes with only a few hours between sessions. Interrogation rooms were air-conditioned and set to the coldest possible temperatures. During interrogations, some victims were threatened with having the nail pulled out or needles inserted into the hands. Interrogators also provided victims with details about their families, their composition, activities, and such, and threatened to harm them. The threats caused deep distress and fear for the safety of their loved ones. Some priests spent weeks in solitary confinement before being transferred to communal cells. During their detention, they were subjected to a torture environment involving various methods deliberately designed to inflict severe mental and physical suffering, including interrogations that were relentless and lasted 24 hours a day, limited access to natural light, food and medical care, sleep deprivation, severe restriction on visits and legal meetings, which were always conducted in the presence of police officers, a total ban of religious activities, including the possession of a Bible or praying out loud. One victim reported that during the first month of detention, the cells were illuminated 24 hours a day by artificial light, and he had to sleep naked with his eyes covered by his underwear. These acts of torture specifically target Christians who have been arbitrarily detained for 3 main reasons: opening churches to demonstrators during the most critical days of the 2018 protests, persistently criticizing government actions that resulted in severe human rights violations, and calling for the release of Bishop Rondo Alvarez in the sermons, who was detained and tortured for 11 months, and he was finally released and exiled in the Vatican in January 2024. Those acts committed in prisons against Christians are carried out to punish detainees, intimidate them, extract information, and pressure them into giving false testimony against other detainees or persecuted individuals. So it is a clear violation of the Convention Against Torture, which Nicaragua signed in 1985 and ratified in 2005. And according to UN experts, it is clearly, those acts of torture clearly constitute a crime against humanity. But the horror does not end there. We must also highlight the systematic persecution of Christians, which constitutes the crime against humanity of persecution. Indeed, the documented crimes against humanity of imprisonment, torture, and deportation have been carried out as part of a political motivated discriminatory campaign orchestrated from the highest levels of government. Christians are particularly targeted due to their participation in the national dialogue and in the defense of human rights. the social mobilization capacity, and the influence of the Catholic hierarchy over its members and Nicaraguan society. These elements are also evident in the speeches given by President Ortega and Murillo against the Catholic Church, describing the Vatican as deprived, pedophile, or mafia. It is because they are Christians that Christians have been victims of grave and systematic violations and abuses of all of their rights. The crimes against humanity committed in Nicaragua against Christians, including torture, arbitrary imprisonment, and religious persecution, must not go unpunished. Under international law, these acts entail individual criminal responsibility for the Ortega-Murillo regime leaders, as well as state responsibility before international bodies. The international community, through the UN, the European Union, and the Organization of American States, must take action. The withdrawal of Nicaragua from the Organization of American States in 2023 and the withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council last February is a blatant attempt to escape international scrutiny. However, this withdrawal does not absolve the regime of its human rights obligations and does not halt ongoing UN investigations. The work of the UN group of experts will continue, and the Universal Periodic Review of Nicaragua remains to be adopted during this 58th session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thibault. We're going to try one more time to get Mariam and her story from Sudan. Is she available? All right. Go ahead, Mariam. The floor is yours.
Yeah, don't worry, Mariam. Actually, what you can do is you can speak, and I will put your voice here. So that's fine. Let's do that.
That's
so
okay.
please take the floor.
Okay, actually.
Can you hear her? Okay, go ahead, Mariam.
Some of you who don't know my story, I'm a Muslim father and a Christian mother.
We can't hear you. I am the technical moderator and we can't hear you at all. Can you unmute your microphone?
Maybe I'm on the phone that I
Can you talk to the
Yeah,
mic?
I'm just gonna say, you guys call me like, I'll be staying and listening, not speaking.
She will stay and listen to the other speakers and apologize again.
Very sorry not to hear your experience at this time. Well, the question is, what can we do in the face of these grave violations? It is my honor now to turn to Shahid Mobeen to read a statement on behalf of Mr. David Dionisi, Special Envoy for Religious Freedom of Italy. Shahid Mobeen is the president of the Religious Freedom Roundtable in Italy. Shahid, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to all the friends in presence and connected online, and all the missions also who are here to listen to the whole picture given by all activists and all of us. I would like to say that when I came in this building, I saw faces from all over the world. And it seemed to be that people were coming here for with a hope. So it seems to be a place of hope. So, but that reminds me of being a Pakistani Catholic teaching in the Pontifical Urbaniana University in the Vatican, that we Catholics are celebrating the Jubilee year announced by the Pope as a year of hope. So we are working together, and we are in another symbolic praise to hope for the betterment of humanity, considering all the human rights. And I would say thank you to Mr. Joseph Jansen and Hulda and all the team of Jubilee Campaign who organized this panel to talk of persecuted Christians in the world, which seems is quite an indifferent argument all over the world when you talk of persecuted Christians. As president of the Italian Roundtable on Religious Freedom and Belief, which originated from the Italian civil society, then officially recognized by Davide Dionisi, the special envoy, who asked me to greet all of you, and Minister Antonio Tajani, for Foreign Affairs, who is also Vice Premier, nominated him for this service. So we, as a civil society voice, together with the official voice of the country, we are willing to help in this mission all the friends and institutions present here. As Italian Roundtable, we interact systematically with and through parliamentarians, diplomatic corps, academic and research institutions, and international institutions working with the same mission to protect and create awareness on the fundamental right of religious freedom of all human beings, with particular attention to the persecuted Christians. The eschatological message of Jesus Christ in the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 10, delineates hope when he teaches that blessed are those who are persecuted in the cause of uprightness. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. Living the message of Christ of loving and forgiving one's enemies, we Christians turn our other cheek when someone slaps on one cheek. Luke 6:27-31. Whereas, when brought to justice and tortured in hatred to our faith, we raise our voice and exercise the right to ask, as Jesus did by saying, if there is some offense in what I said, point it out. But if not, why do you strike me? According to the last biennial report of 2022 on religious freedom in 196 countries, and next one will be published soon, of the Pontifical Foundation Aid to the Church in Need, it seems Christianity is the first persecuted religion in the world. The golden rule, as the common principle for many religions, is we must treat others as we wish others to treat us. All human beings live and move in countries which have their constitutions and penal codes to respect this fundamental right and to protect and to prevent any abuse of law or any exercise which undermines religious freedom and human dignity. A report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Nazila Ghanea, dated 9 January 2025, analyzes the global real situation of the freedom of religion or belief and the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and provides with concrete measures to make possible the implementation of existing UNO treaties in respect of human dignity and religious freedom. Along with it, Jubilee campaign's contribution to the Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment abuses and mistreatment of religious prisoners of conscience in selected countries like Algeria, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, and Yemen not only highlights the recent particulars of the use of torture, but along with preventive recommendations on these 7 countries, provides also 5 synthetic but detailed proposals for the global governance, and making it evident that even if the global willingness is there to respect the victims' rights and legally manage the public servants' administration of given authority, there are grief abuses not only by state and government authorities for personal gains of the in-charge individuals, but there are ideologically motivated groups in the state's administration and residing in the societies, which radicalize the public servants and use the mobs incited to hatred or political, economic, and religious gains. The extrajudicial killings of Catholic minister Shahbaz Bhatti in hatred of his faith because a Christian was made in charge to review the almost 10 articles of the penal code, so-called blasphemy laws, since it is abused to kill, persecute, and discriminate not only religious minorities, and that of a Muslim governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, who, while defending Asia Bibi, called black laws the same articles in question. These killings are concrete examples of how a state has failed to protect and develop its religious minorities. The killing of Shahbaz Bhatti has not been taken, the killers of Shahbaz Bhatti have not been still taken to justice till today, whereas the bodyguard who shot the governor was executed to death, and today his place of sepulchre has become a shrine of a religious martyr, which continues to inspire radicalization, terrorism, and promotes hatred towards other religions. In economically poor countries, such places and social attitudes in the places of formation contribute as well as in the international terrorism. The state in question remains powerless, even if there might be a will to discourage such indoctrinations. I'm going to the last paragraph. As mentioned in Nazila Ghanea's report, I would underline the need of UNO and member states representatives to inquire through the instituted channels, encourage the official visits of the representatives, not only with the related government authorities, but also a regular and systematic contact with human rights bodies working in these countries, which is not a very simple thing to do. Not only in the economically underdeveloped countries, but in many others, special envoys on religious freedom do not exist. And this itself shows how much the question is of less importance for the national governments in general. In several countries, educational systems and their contents have been used to promote hatred and radicalize people from their childhood. So the local syllabus need an overall review. Introduction of the studies of history of religions, subjects on intercultural and interreligious dialogue can pave a path towards building a culture of reciprocal recognition of each one's human dignity and freedom, which will bring people together, individuals and communities, for a universal spirit of brotherhood. Last but not the least, the European Union's role in this regard is very important. But since the constitution of the new European government, still the office of the European Union envoy on religious freedom outside Europe is vacant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahid, and thank you for mentioning the EU, because it is now my honor to introduce Swedish member of the European Parliament, Charlie Weimer. Mr. Weimer is a vocal voice against anti-blasphemy laws, particularly in Pakistan. and spoke during the unanimous adoption of the EU resolution in support of Joseph Jansen's sister. He has prepared a pre-recorded statement.
Dear friends, fellow defenders of religious freedom, you've gathered to discuss the urgent crisis of religious persecution of Christians. Our response cannot be limited to words, and to make clear to all that those that repress our faith, or indeed any faith, will face consequences. For millions of Christians worldwide, practicing their faith is not just a spiritual journey, it's a daily test of courage. We see this in many countries. I want to highlight a few of them, but they are not isolated cases, but part of a global pattern of targeting those who dare to profess their faith. So let's look at some examples. In Pakistan, where blasphemy laws are wielded as weapons against Christians and other minorities, blasphemy laws, which carry the death penalty, have been turned into a tool of terror and are often used to settle personal disputes, silence dissent, and instill fear. Nadim Masih, falsely accused through a WhatsApp message, has been on death row for 8 years. Anwar Kenneth, deemed mentally unfit, has spent 23 years in prison on blasphemy charges. Shagufta Kiran, a mother of 4, languishing in jail over a social media post. Mobs continue to attack Christian neighborhoods with impunity. In the Jaranwala riots, where 26 churches were burned, over 300 arrests were made, but nearly all the suspects were released on bail. In Eritrea, where believers are thrown into underground prisons simply for gathering to worship. Worship outside state-approved religions is treated as treason. Thousands of Christians, particularly Pentecostals and evangelicals, have been jailed without trial. Patriarch Abuna Antonios, head of the Eritrean Orthodox Church, was imprisoned for 15 years until his death. Nicaragua, where the Ortega regime has turned the Catholic Church into an enemy of the state. Since 2018, the government has imprisoned clergy, expelled nuns, and confiscated church-run schools and charities. The regime has stripped priests and bishops of their citizenship, turning them into stateless exiles. And Bishop Rolando Alvarez was sentenced to 26 years in jail. In Sudan, Christians are again facing persecution in the chaos of civil war that has shattered any hope for religious freedom. More than 100 churches have been attacked since the war began. Christians, especially converts from Islam, face violence, abductions, and execution. We should be honest. The world's response has been woefully inadequate. But what about the European response? The European Union has long declared itself a champion of religious freedom. And the European Union and the European Parliament have, from time to time, condemned the persecution. In 2021, we called on Pakistan to amend its blasphemy laws and ensure justice. We've called for targeted sanctions and an end to EU financial support for Eritrea's dictatorship. We've called for universal jurisdiction to prosecute Ortega's crimes. We see clearly that words alone are not enough and that declarations do not save lives. Action does. The Union must go further. The time for gentle diplomatic pressure is over. We must make EU trade aid funding and visas conditional on religious freedom reforms and ending persecution. We must sanction regimes and hold the presidents, prime ministers, generals, and warlords that order such persecution accountable for crimes against Christians and other religious minorities under international law. Through reckless immigration policies, the problem of religious persecution is spreading. We've welcomed individuals who hold the very same extremist beliefs that drive the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia to make their home in Europe. And we've allowed radical preachers to spread hatred in our cities. We've seen attacks on European churches rise, vandalism, arson, and even murders. In France, where I am right now, more than 800 churches were desecrated in a single year. How can we claim to defend religious freedom abroad while failing to protect Christians in our own countries? How can we criticize Pakistan's blasphemy laws when European citizens fear being attacked for wearing a cross, expressing their faith publicly, or just expressing their views on different religions? If Europe is serious about defending religious freedom, we must not only confront persecution abroad, but also take back control at home. We must end the appeasement of those who bring the ideology of Christian persecution into our cities. The persecution of Christians is not just a human rights issue. It's a moral crisis. And as representatives of free nations, we have a duty to act. History will judge us by whether we stood for those who suffer for their faith. Thank you, and God bless.
Well, we have heard personal stories. We have heard about the issue. We've heard calls to action. And so there is a lot to contemplate and take away. And I am getting the big T from the back of the room. So I'm afraid our time is up and we have run down the clock. But thank you very much for joining us. And I think there's another event here. So if you would like to speak with any of the speakers, please do so outside the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much.